So as you've seen by now, every time we start working with a composition, we basically can get anywhere unless we start importing media into that composition. The media imports become layers, and layers represent two things. Basically, they represent what you see on the stack, the position of an item within the stack, and they also represent the way things look through time on the timeline. So basically, that is the purpose of layers. However, layers can do a lot more. And as you saw from the previous videos, this is in the layers is where we apply the transformation keyframes so that we can modify the different properties of the actual layer or the media that we're working with and so on. So what we're going to be doing right now is I'm going to be importing several pieces of media into my composition. So I'm going to go ahead and press Control I or Command I on the Mac, and then I'm going to go ahead and choose from here. I'm going to choose Moon and Rocket. Those are the first two things I am going to be importing. So those are two Illustrator files that you bring in. I'm also going to be importing a file called flames.mov. And notice that I didn't change any of the settings here. I'm importing them as footage. So it imports as footage. And then I'm going to be importing also something called Milky Way. So I have basically a setting, a bunch of files that I've imported with different weird names that I have imported into my project. Now I'm going to create me a composition. And this composition I'm going to be calling Moon Landing. And just because that's what the animation that I'm going to be trying to create in this animation. So I'm going to leave the settings at 1280 by 720, which is the way that we left them at when we last worked in After Effects. And I'm going to keep everything as is, basically 10 seconds in length on my duration. My empty start at 0. And my my resolution at full for preview. So everything, I'm not touching anything here other than the naming convention of the composition. So when I click OK on that, I get my composition window open and I get my timeline ready to receive files. So I want to place, the first thing I want to place here is going to be the background, which is going to be the Milky Way that goes all the way in the back. And that's a gigantic image, as you can see. As a matter of fact, the file is 5,600 pixels by 3,800 almost. Then I'm going to be placing the file Moon right above it. And that is an Illustrator file. And then on top of that, I'm going to be placing my rocket. And then behind the rocket, I'm going to be placing the Flames movie that I have. So as you can see, I have pretty much set up everything in my composition. Now let's focus on the layers for just a second. What are these layers doing? Well, they first provide us the visual for what we're working on. And then over here in the Premiere side and the video editing side of things, they allow me to add keyframes for properties and so on. You will notice that different layers have different colors. Colors are very important within After Effects. They indicate visually what you're working with. So if you're working with something that is a graphic or a JPEG, they will look like purple bars. If you're working with movie clips or audio, they'll look like green bars. So everything has a different color assigned to it, as you will see throughout the semester. You can change the color by going into the swatches here if you want to and assigning a different color. But I never change that. I always leave it as default because it works well with the default setting that Adobe has provided to us. So I don't change it. However, I do change my naming convention for my layers. And that is because, as you can see, they give you really weird names. The names are based on the name of the file that you've imported. So if the file is called rocket.ai, because it is an Illustrator file, it's going to keep that naming convention. However, that's kind of like a tongue twister for me every time I'm trying to read it through all these labels. So what I want to do is I want to label things with my naming convention. So if I wanted to just call this rocket, I could simply select the layer, hit the return or enter key on the keyboard to highlight the title, and then rename it to what I want to rename it, then hit return. Now that doesn't change the name of the file in your computer. It only changes the reference name in this layer. It doesn't even change the name on your project window. The name is still there, rocket.ai. It just changes the name reference here in the stack of layers. So if I want to call this Flames, or let's call them Flames, why not? Flames, it's a good name. This would be Moon. So I'm going to select it, hit the return or enter key, depending on what system you're working on. I'm going to call that Moon. And then this one will be just Starfield. Okay, so you see that it's basically a completely different name from what it was. Now, if you want to know what those files are named within your project window, you can simply click up here where it says layer name, and they display the source name. But if you want to see the actual layer name that you have assigned to it, click on that source name, and it shows you the layer name. So that makes your workflow a little bit easier. Also, let's take a look at all these things that we have activated as we start bringing down media from the project window into our timeline. On the left-hand side is the visual switch. This turns on and off your layers. So if I want to see a video or not see it, or a piece of footage, then all I have to do, if I don't want to see it, I can hide it by clicking on the eye, and you'll notice that the rocket disappears. Now, the layer is still there, but the visual of it has disappeared. If I don't want to see, if I want to lock that layer so that nothing happens to it, I can click on the lock layer. These are no different than what you have seen in programs such as Photoshop or Illustrator, so you know this. Now, this switch here is the solo switch. So if I only want to see the rocket, I don't want to see anything else, I can solo that layer, and you'll notice that everything gets hidden, but the rocket, that's the only thing that I'm looking at. Now, the other layers are still there. I didn't delete them. I just simply soloed that layer. You can solo more than one layer, by the way. So if you want to see the rocket and the moon, for example, there it is. All you have to do is just turn on the solo switch for it. Okay. Now, we've saw before the transformations on the drop-down, and we know that that is something that's where we create our keyframes. Let's move on to the right a little bit, and let's talk about these switches over here. What we call switches is basically things that you can turn on and off within specific layers. So they include hiding a layer if you're getting too much real estate, because as you see right now, I only have 4 layers and they take up half of the real estate available to me on my timeline. If at some point I get to the point where I have too many layers, but there are some that I still need to keep and I don't want to delete them or hide them, not turn them off. I really want to see them, but I don't want them to take up space within my timeline. I can make them shy layers. That's what this little guy showing its nose over a wall indicates. That's basically a little head with a nose sticking out. And if you make them shy, if you make layers shy, you'll notice that nothing happened so far. But when I activate that switch up here, if I click on that, those 3 layers sort of go away. They're hidden for now. They're shy layers. They're still available in here, and I still have access to them. I can still move them around if I select the actual artwork, but they are hidden on the stack. That means that I actually have now more real estate. If the real estate is an issue, this is all strictly workflow. They do not affect your rendering. They do not affect the way you are looking at things on the screen. They simply save your real estate down here. If you want to bring them back, turn them on. And by the way, if you click on one and drag across all of them, then you actually activate that switch for all of them. So you need to click on one, keep your mouse clicked, and drag up or down in order to activate that particular switch for all the layers that you're rolling over. Now, these 2 little things, that the little switch that is right next underneath that little sun, that sun is something that allows you to maintain the quality of any vector-based file by continuously rasterizing. What that means is when you export a file out of After Effects, the file, even though it might be vectored in origin, will be turned into a pixel-based image. Each frame is pixel-based. When you look at videos, you don't see videos as vectors. You see the representation of vectors, but in pixels. So at some point, that's called rasterization. You need to rasterize anything that you have created in vectors. This means that the quality has to be re-rendered every time for every frame. This is one of the reasons why it takes so long to render anything in After Effects, because basically it looks at every little detail of the file origin and it translates it into something that can be output into video format. And in this case, that's what it's doing. So why do I have this continuously rasterized switch available? Well, if you notice, even though this is an Illustrator file, I have been taught in my Illustrator classes that if I increase the size of a file that is vector-based, the quality of the file does not suffer. Well, let's take a look and see what happens to this vector-based file, the rocket. I'm going to open up its scale, and I'm going to increase its size to about 1200. You see that it gets pixelated. Well, that shouldn't happen. because this is a vector-based file. That's where continuous rasterization comes in handy. If I activate that switch for that layer, you'll notice that it brings back the quality. So it will maintain the quality of the original file and not give you any pixelization, even if you make your file as big as you want. Bear in mind, however, that increasing the size of vector files to gigantic sizes is requesting that the program computes that information every single frame and renders it as pixels. It rasterizes it for you, which means basically render time. The more you do things like this, the more render time you're adding to your final render. So it's something to keep in mind. Now let me bring that back again to 100%. And you'll notice that the quality of the rocket is basically as it was when it first started. So if you're not increasing the size of the size of your vector-based files, do not activate continuous rasterization. Okay, if you are, do so. You can activate this thing. It also works for something that is called that we can work with on precompositions, and we're going to be talking about precompositions at the end of this module. So keep in mind that continuously rasterize switch, because it's something we're going to be using not just for maintaining the quality of these, but also how they affect precompositions. To the right of these, we have the quality switch, which basically is the sampling of how things look on the screen. So if I click on that, I am lowering the quality. And you'll notice that on the edges of the file, as I take a look at the side of the rocket, as I loop through the different quality settings. So the lower quality, which is this quality, that's draft quality, basically it gives you pixelization. That improves your playback time within the screen, but it does affect the way it renders. So you need to make sure that this is activated to full quality before you export, if you ever change these. In all honesty, I never change this switch, never touch it. But some people might have very little RAM, so if you're running into RAM issues, this would be one place to actually lower the quality of layers. To see the previews, make sure you go back and up the quality. Once again, it's as simple as clicking on one of them and then dragging across the others, and you'll see that it affects the changes in all of the different layers that you're rolling over, okay? Over here is the switch for effects, and if we were applying effects, let's say, for example, I wanted to apply a drop shadow to that rocket, it would be as simple as going into my effects presets and looking for drop shadow. Remember, effects presets is on the right-hand side. Effects and presets is on the right-hand side. That's the screen, the window that contains all of your different categories for filters within the program. You also find your filters under effects, under the effects drop-down up here, and you have access to all of the effects, different options over here. So I'm looking for it, but the reason why I like using the effects window on the right-hand side is because it allows me to filter through all the filters. So if I want to apply a drop shadow to this rocket, all I got to do is on this little window up here, I'll start typing drop shadow, and there it is. It filters everything out, and it only gives me the filter that I want. To apply a filter to a layer, all you need to do is select the layer that you want to apply the filter to, and then either double click on the icon here. So if I double click on that icon, notice that I have the rocket layer selected. If I double click on the icon for the filter, it applies the effect. So let me undo that really quick. Go back to project so everything is set up. And then by the way, undoing is Control Z or Command Z on the Mac. So the other way to apply a filter is to actually drag the filter from the icon either to the footage or to the layer itself. So you can do one of those three ways: double clicking on the effects, dragging it to the footage on the composition window, or dragging it to the layer in the timeline. So once you let go of it, a new window is opened up called the Effect Controls right on your project window. It should open up there. If it doesn't open, you will find it in your window dropdown. It's down here, Effect Controls. So you can go ahead and click on that, and it will open up the window, giving you access to what your filters look like, the different properties for that specific filter. In my case, the drop shadow filter is the same. It works the same as it does in Photoshop and Illustrator, with the gigantic difference that you have this puppy next to each one of the properties. Remember what this does from our transformations video? Basically, this is telling you any of these things is keyframeable through time, which means you can bring your drop shadow to life by applying animation to the drop shadow itself. So if you want to change the size of the drop shadow, the sharpness of the drop shadow through time, that is something that you can actually do. So let me go ahead and increase the distance of the drop shadow and increase the softness. Notice that I am changing those numbers by clicking on the number, not letting go of my mouse, and then dragging left and right. You see that the mouse gives you, when you roll over the numbers, the mouse gives you the finger. And that finger has two little arrows to the left and right of it, which means that if you click and drag, you change the settings by clicking and dragging. And that's what I'm doing. Okay, so that is the drop shadow that I've applied to it. Now you'll notice that the layer has the switch for effects activated for it. If I am running into issues with RAM and effects can take up a lot of RAM, then you might want to turn it off by simply clicking on the effect switch. Now the effect switch, turning it off this way turns it off on preview, but if you want to make sure that it's activated at the end, go back and activate it. Or on the cue, make sure that you say, please activate all filters, and they will all effects, and they will all be applied. Now to the right of that are other switches. This one right here is the motion blur switch. And the motion blur switch basically creates motion blur based on the camera settings that we discussed at the beginning of the course when we were talking about composition. So if I move this really fast across the screen, I don't want to see a mechanically linear looking motion. I want to see a blur as it's moving across the screen, because that's how things look in the real world. How does that work? Well, let me go ahead and apply a position keyframe for that layer, for this layer. Let me move the rocket here. I'll apply a position keyframe here. And in less than 15 frames, I want that to be across the screen. Now, as I scrub the video, you'll notice that I see in every frame, in every in-between frame, I see a full quality rocket. That's not what I want. I want to make sure that as it's moving super fast, in less than half a second it's moving across the screen, I want to see some kind of blurriness around it. So the way to do that is by activating that motion blur switch. So if I click on it, you'll notice that my rocket now becomes blurry, giving me a more natural look. Now, what is the difference between those two? Let me go ahead and bring in my work area endpoint to the 1 second mark. Now, at this point, I'm going to teach you a couple of shortcuts. It's called the IBON, I-B-O-N, set of shortcuts. The I, if I press I on the keyboard, my time marker goes to the beginning point of my layer, whatever layer I have selected. So if I select the rocket layer and I press I, you'll see my time marker jumps to the beginning point. If I have my time marker here and I press the B as in boy key, the beginning point of my work area moves to whatever my time marker happens to be. So I sends my time marker to the beginning of the layer. B brings the beginning of the work area to whatever the time marker happens to be. Let me bring that back again. Now I want to bring out the out point. If I press the O key on the keyboard, my time marker goes to the end of the layer that has been selected. Notice that if I bring it to 1 and I press O, it goes to that point. And if I have my time marker here, and that's where I want the end of my work area, I'll press the letter N. And it brings upstream the end of my work area. So it's IBON, I-B-O-N. Remember those shortcuts. Now with this setup, when I play this back, you'll notice that I have a short preview of this moving across the screen, and you'll see how mechanical that rocket looks. I can see it clearly across all of the different frames. When I activate the motion blur for it, you'll notice that the motion is a lot smoother because I am seeing a blur as it's going in between frames, which is what makes sense. I want it to look that way. So that is a switch that is, I advise applying it to everything that you move on the screen. It makes your motion a lot more natural, okay? Now, we have adjustment layers set up for different layers, and we're going to be talking about adjustment layers in the near future, so let's not talk about that just right now. And the same thing with 3D layers. If you want to make a layer 3D, you would activate this switch, and that's something that we're going to be talking about in two weeks. Right here, we have parenting switches, which is also something that we're going to be talking about 2 weeks. So now, what else can you do with a layer? Well, let's say, for example, I want this rocket to only exist for 1 second. Can I trim the layer? And the answer is yes. You can go ahead and if you roll over the endpoint of any of your layers, you'll notice that the mouse changes, or your cursor changes to those two arrows, left and right, which means you can click and drag that point in time. If you press shift as you are dragging and keep it pressed, it will snap to different points. It will snap to the beginning, it will snap to keyframes, or it will snap to time markers. So if I want to bring in my endpoint for that layer, my out point, to where time marker is, I'll go to the end of it and drag it and press shift as I'm dragging so that I can snap to that time marker. With the time marker also in place, I can press the Alt and close bracket key. Alt and close bracket being the square parentheses. That is the key that is usually right above your enter or return key on your keyboard. That's the close bracket. The one that is underneath the squiggly bracket, that's what you want to press, Alt and close, to bring up the endpoint of a layer. Let me undo that. Or if I want to bring downstream the endpoint of a layer, I can press Alt and open bracket. That is how I trim layers with shortcuts. Okay, Alt, open bracket to bring down the endpoint, and Alt, close bracket to bring upstream the out point of a layer. So that's how you would trim layers. Okay, you can, once trimmed the layer, you can go ahead and move it on time. So basically you have that entire time. As long as you have timeline, you can position your layers whatever you want in time. So say, for example, that's the animation length that you want, but you only want it to happen after second one. Well, you can just move your animation downstream. Let me stretch out my work area, and you'll notice that the rocket appears at that point. And after the end of that out point, it disappears. So I no longer have access to that footage within the layer. What happens if I want to see it again? Well, you would have either create a new layer for this, because a layer can only hold one piece of footage with the way we're working right now, or you would create a pre-composition of layers, which is something we're going to see at the end of this module. So those are the basics of layers and the switches that you're seeing on the interface. And this is basically the way you would manipulate the actual video editing portion of the layers within your timeline.